Let's start as we normally would, having some awareness of our posture and the breathing. We can start seated. Let's take a few deep breaths, noticing how we're seated. We cross our legs or sit any way is comfortable. Taking a few rounded breaths. Bringing some awareness into where we're seated, the hips and the lower back. Pressing the lower back forward a bit, flattening that lower back a bit. Then bracing the core inward and opening the chest. A few more rounded breaths with awareness in the body. Now we can move onto a tabletop posture, hands and knees. We'll move forward and back over the hands, feeling a stretch around the wrists. Also moving in circles. The sensation of the fingers and the palms stretched and flat against the ground. Now, let's do a few cat-cow poses. Exhaling and rounding, inhaling and arching. A few times. Let's press back into child's pose. A few breaths. And let's step up, work up to the hands and press back into downward facing dog. Pedaling the feet, noticing the sensation. Doesn't have to be a perfect posture, but we can also be in a plank pose and pedaling the feet to start, or moving into downward facing dog. Returning the knees to the mat if we'd like, into child's pose, and then coming back up into downward facing dog. Returning to the mat with the knees and pressing back in the child's pose again. Looking up between the hands, let's do another downward facing dog. And then prepare to step in between the hands into a forward fold. Down dog. Then stepping into forward fold. Raising up the flat back, halfway up, and exhaling, folding, letting the neck hang loosely. Feeling the stretch in the neck and slowly rolling up to standing. Feeling grounded in the standing pose. You can stay standing towards the front of the mat. Let's do a few standing side bends. Raising one arm overhead, keeping that same side heel rooted down, and reaching that arm up and overhead. Stretching through the fingertips. Releasing the arm down into standing pose. Rooting down into the other heel, and that side arm raising overhead. Stepping again in the front of the mat. Let's step back into lunge pose with one leg. That's with both feet pointing forward. A slight bend in the front knee. And generally a lengthened back leg. Could be a slight bend in the knee. Noticing that our core is more working towards being tucked, not so much, this is a lot of roundedness. Nothing wrong with that, but we're trying to also engage the core and allow all the other musculature to follow that. Because with this, there's not as much engagement in the muscles as with this. Breathing, etc. Put our hands towards the front and the hands together. Let's spread our fingertips apart and then pivot towards the other side. So we can also have the other leg now in the back, lengthened, and lunging with the opposite leg in the front. With more awareness around the core again, kind of flattening that lower back, bracing the core, and opening the chest. Taking a few moments to breathe. Again, spreading the fingertips. Now let's pivot back to the other side. Stepping again to the front of the mat. Taking a few breaths here. Let's move into a balance portion. I'll just face you here. We'll start with a standing pigeon pose, where we put one ankle above the opposite knee. We can see the lower foot, so we're pressing the hips back, lengthening through the torso and folding forward. Feeling the sensation along the upper thigh, the outside here. As an option, we can move into eagle pose, crossing the front leg around the back leg, and that same side arm underneath the other elbow. Squaring our hips towards the front, bracing the core, opening the chest a little bit. Taking a few breaths. And returning to standing. For a breath. We'll move to the other side with our balance pose in standing pigeon. Now I'm on a 6mm yoga mat on top of carpet, so it's very squishy, not a flat surface. That could be good for the sole of the foot, I'm sure, in some ways, to adapt to that. Move into eagle pose on that side. That leg around the front and the same side arm underneath the other elbow. Squaring the hips towards the front, opening the chest. Then returning to standing. Work on one more standing posture here. Triangle pose with a block for support. I can show you. We can start standing, stepping back with one leg. It's sort of a 45-degree, and the other leg towards the front, the foot towards the front. And a slight bend in the front knee, but both knees extended, both legs extended. We're going to open our torso towards the side, and then opening towards the sky as we're lowering down, engaging the upper side abdomen, reaching toward the ankle or the toe. And as an option, we could place the block next to the front foot, but really engaging this upper side abdomen and twisting open towards the sky. Extending the arm up. Returning to standing and stepping to the front of the mats or pivoting to the other side. Stepping back with the other leg this time. Moving into triangle pose on the other side. Opening the hips area. Engaging the abdomen as we're moving towards the ankle. Maybe placing the block. Twisting open up the torso. Raising the arm overhead. Returning to standing and stepping to the front of the mat. Let's lower down. We could do one salutation, vinyasa rather. Inhaling, raising our arms overhead, and exhaling, folding. Raising up with a flat back and exhaling, stepping back with both legs into plank or knees on the mat. Lowering down and raising into cobra or upward facing dog. And then pressing back into downward facing dog or child's pose. Now meeting in child's pose, bringing the forehead down towards the ground.